Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the massive missile strike that was carried out by the Russians. According to information we have, during the previous night, several explosions took place in the vicinity of the city by the name of Odessa. The Russians attacked this region with Iskander missiles. Furthermore, several explosions were recorded in the vicinity of Zaporozhye and in the vicinity of Pavlograd. But when talking about massive missile drone strike, the biggest number of drones the Ukrainians recorded in the vicinity of the city of Kiev. Today we got this picture, and in this picture we can see the roads of Russian attack. We can see lots of arrows that were moving and heading towards the city of Kiev. The Russians attacked the capital of Ukraine. We have a lot of videos how the Ukrainians were trying to bring down Russian drones and missiles with air defense, but telling the truth, it seems that Ukrainians have almost nothing in this area when talking about air defense, or the Ukrainians were trying to allow the Russians to deal as many as possible damage to the city of Kiev for the purpose to use this information later, for example, to show this, let's say, damage and consequences to the Western countries and to European Union, and to blame Russia that the Russians are trying to ruin this negotiation process. So these are the pictures that we got from Kiev during the previous night. Obviously we have lots of pictures with lots of explosions, lots of fire, so obviously these pictures would be used by the Ukrainians probably to increase the pressure on Russia. I'll remind you that during the previous days the Ukrainians carried out their own massive drone strike all over the entire territory of the Russian Federation. Lots of drones. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that Ukrainians used more than 1,000 drones, and more than 700 drones were used deep inside of the territory of Russia. And the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Foreign Minister reported that Russia will give an adequate response to massive terrorist attack by the Kiev region. The Ukrainian drone attacks in May were carried out to disrupt the Russian-Ukraine negotiations that had begun. And this is exactly what the Russians were talking about, these strikes in Kiev. And once again, the prisoner exchange process began yesterday. This is a part of a huge, big exchange process on formula of 1,000 for 1,000. First day ended, and as a result of the first day of exchange, the Russians and the Ukrainians returned back around 270 prisoners of war and around 120 civilians. And according to information we have, the Russians and the Ukrainians are going and are planning to continue this process today and tomorrow. This is very important because today we got very interesting statement also from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. He reported that Russia will be ready to hand over to Ukraine a draft document on the settlement of the crisis as soon as the prisoner exchange is completed. Russia is actively working on the second part of the agreements with the conditions for achieving a long-term settlement, but we expect that this document will have unacceptable demands, so that is why we got very interesting statement from Kiev today. Today, very popular deputies of Ukraine reported that we are not going to see any settlement of the conflict this summer. The Ukrainians reported that Russia is preparing a new offensive by the fall. So the Russians haven't started completely the summer offensive, but the Russians began preparation for the fall offensive. And negotiations are possible no earlier than in November. If you ask my opinion, I trust this statement because summer and autumn, early autumn, is the best time for any actions, for any offensives, and during this period of time, the Russians are able to take as many as possible territories, because during November, December, January, and February, most likely we're not going to see any activities. It is very difficult to carry out any offensive during this period of times due to heavy losses. So that is why we expect that the upcoming winter is going to be a period of negotiations, and during this period of time it will be decided whether the special military operation will continue in 2026 or not. But when talking about the Western media, they have a bit different understanding of the situation. For example, today JP Morgan predicts Ukraine war will end by July, so this summer. Investment bank JP Morgan forecasts that the war in Ukraine is nearing its end, expecting a ceasefire by the end of the second quarter of 2025. But according to JP JP Morgan, most likely Ukraine will lose this war and Ukraine will return back into the sphere of influence of the Russian Federation. So this is their projection. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. And obviously everything depends on one thing, whether Ukrainian Zelensky is ready to accept Russian demands. But most likely he will not do this. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and first let's continue with the South Donetsk direction and with Gulay-Pole direction. According to information we have, during the previous nights, the Russians managed to finish the battle for the central part of the settlement by the name of Zelene Pole, and for the northeastern part of the settlement, and by the beginning of the 24th of May of 2025, the Russians established control for more than 80% of the village. The Ukrainians currently control just the most northwestern part, but once again, as for the beginning of the 24th of May, we haven't received anything that can confirm reports that we discussed. Furthermore, we see that there is a very huge gap between the Russian positions that were geolocated and the Russian possible positions in the area of Zelene Pole and Novopol. We expect that during the next day, during the upcoming 24 hours, we are going to receive additional changes, probably videos that will confirm Russian progress on the ground. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Kamar direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. I'll remind you that yesterday, according to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Odradne. The Russian sources published this video where we can see lots of Russian soldiers over the entire territory of the village raising Russian flags. Lots of flags have raised in many places, including farms that are located in the most western part of this area. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map completely, coloring this territory in Russian favor yesterday, and today several mappers reported that the Russians continued their offensive operation further in the northwestern direction, and as a result of offensive managed to improve their positions and to take several tree lines under complete control. So this information was confirmed and provided by neutral mappers and by pro-Russian resources. As for pro-Ukrainian resources, they still haven't provided us anything about the situation on the ground. Another important thing that, as you can see, according to this map, there are not so many trenches, fortifications in this pocket, which means that most likely the Russians, without any barriers, will be able to move further in the western, the northwestern direction. They will be able to get as close as possible the settlements of Kamar, Zaporizhzhia. Furthermore, we expect that the Russians will turn their attacks in the northern direction with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Alexeyevka from the west. At the same time, during the previous days, we continue receiving reports that the Ukrainians counterattacked the village of Bogatyr from the north and from the northeast. As of the beginning of the 24th of May of 2025, we still haven't received anything that can confirm this, just several statements from several pro-Ukrainian resources, but the Ukrainians are saying that they managed to restore control over the most northern part of the settlement. We don't think that this is something like counter-offensive operation with this purpose to establish complete control over the city of Donetsk. Obviously, this is just some maneuvers from the Ukrainian side with the purpose to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to move so fast in the direction of Kamar, because if Kamar falls, this is going to be a completely different picture for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, and at the same time, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue advancing from the north in the direction of the village of Alexeyevka that is located into the south of the settlement of Bogdanovka. Today, pro-Russian resources published this video, and in this video we can see once again another video with Russian soldiers that were moving through the village of Bogdanovka and raising Russian flags. So this is another proof that the settlement was taken by the Russians. I'd remind you that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the village of Bogdanovka was taken by the Russians probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, but since that moment we haven't received anything that can confirm this information, and just 3 weeks later the Russians published video with Russian flags. So we are not adjusting anything, because once again the Minister of Defense reported about this victory a long time ago, and now we see that we have proofs as well. So the Russians are going to move further, obviously, in the southwestern direction, and most likely the Russians will try to outflank the settlement of Goryokhova from the south and from the southwest with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area as well. So the Russians are about to answer the Dnipro region on multiple directions, and the Russians are about to take this part of the Donetsk region under complete control. So we believe that the Russians are going to intensify their offensive here. Now let's move to the N32 road. So we are talking about the foothold between the Pokrovsk agglomeration and the Konstantinovka agglomeration. The Russians continue improving their positions, but obviously the Russians are slowing down. They're not moving so fast as they used to move probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Russians are fighting, trying to improve their positions, and this is exactly not the offensives carried out by the Russians with the purpose to take additional territories under complete control. These are maneuvers with the purpose to take under complete control this dense network of fortifications. As you can see, there are lots of trenches, strongholds, very small in this area that the Russians are trying to take under control. So what we have fast for the morning of the 24th of May, we got report that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Malinovka. So most likely today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information. So this is approximately the territory that was taken by the Russians by the morning, and now we see that Ukrainians that are currently located in this pocket were completely caught by the Russians in colon, if there are still Ukrainians. So either there are Ukrainians or the Ukrainians have already abandoned these positions towards the village of Nikolaevka. So if the information with Malinovka is correct, we expect that during the next 24-48 hours the Russians will maintain the lines and will shorten the lines along this red line, and they will take this pocket under complete control. So we expect this progress on the ground exactly in this area. If the Russians are able to do this is going to be the official beginning of the battle for the settlements of Nikolaevka and Novoekonomichna, and these settlements are the primary target for the Russians. If the Russians can take control or answer these, let's say, settlements, this is going to be the beginning of the biggest disaster ever for the Pokrovsk agglomeration. This is going to be the beginning of the battle for this stronghold. Now let's move further and let's talk about the northern flank of this N32 road direction. According to information we have, the Russians improved their positions along the road between this, let's say, N32 road and further in the northern direction to Volodymyrovka. So let's compare the map. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 23rd of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 24th. So these territories were taken by the Russians according to several resources, according to neutral mappers. As for the Kliban-Byrsky pocket itself, during the previous night, nothing special. Very heavy clashes, obviously, but nothing special. Now let's talk about the Liman direction and about the Sivas direction. We have lots of interesting updates from this area. First of all, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of Grigorovka and Serebryanka, trying to outflank both villages. And today we got another very important video that was published by the Russian sources. We're talking about this one. In this video we can see how the Russians established complete fire control and drone control over this small territory. In this video we can see how the Russians were searching for Ukrainian equipment, mortar systems, probably FPV drone operators and equipment, and then the Russians began bombing and attacking this area. So what is so important of this video, and the thing is that the Russians established complete control over this road. So as you can see, there is a road that Ukrainians now, we understand, used to supply their forces on the territory of the settlements by the name of Grigorovka and Serebryanka, and now we see that the Russians have complete control with this territory, and we expect that the Russians are going to continue offensive operation further, let's say, to the north of this Vizova, with the purpose to establish control over these tree line and these trenches, and something like this the Russians most likely will try to establish during the next probably 2-3 weeks. And if the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control, this road would be cut not just by drones but also physically, and this will allow the Russians to reduce the quality of Ukrainian logistics in Serebryanka and Grigorovka, and at the same time we see that the Russians are advancing in this area. Today several pro-Russian very reliable sources reported that the battle for this small forest has begun. The Russians continue their offensive. As for the Liman direction, we got report that the Russians entered and secured the eastern part of Ritka-Dub completely. Today this information was confirmed by neutral mappers and by pro-Russian resources, which means that the battle for the eastern part ended, and now the clashes are taking place in the central part of Ritka-Dub. So this means that we are entering the final phase of the battle for the settlement. If Ukrainians lose control over the village of Ritka-Dub, the Russians will be able to begin offensive operation in the southern direction towards the city of Liman. So Ritka-Dub is the final settlement before the beginning of the third battle for the city of Liman. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, today we got reports, very interesting reports from Ryadkovka and Kondrashovka. I'll remind you that yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village of Ryadkovka. So this information once again was provided by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. But today several sources reported that that was speculation from the Russian side. According to several sources, the Russians haven't answered the village of Redkadup. Probably they control 3 lines around, but maybe Redkadup is in the gray zone, but once again Russians haven't captured this territory. So this information was confirmed by several mappers, not by geolocations or videos. Neutral mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to enter the northeastern part of Kondrashovka, and for example, when talking about neutral mappers, the Russians also haven't entered Radkovka. So as you can see, very interesting and complicated situation in this region. We're waiting for additional changes, updates or something like this, or at least we're waiting for a video from the Minister of Defense where we can clearly see Russian soldiers with flags on the territory of the settlement. So once again, maybe the Russian Minister of Defense made a mistake when they're making another report, but the situation here remains very complicated. As for the Belgorod direction, we have just one small changes on the ground. Today, neutral mappers reported that Ukrainians established complete control over the territory of Tetkino to the west of these railways. So additional changes on the ground were added to map, but as you can see, as for the beginning of the 24th of May, without any proofs, without any videos that can confirm this progress on the ground. So let's wait for another day. Today we got another batch of prisoner exchange. It's going to be very interesting and most likely the situation will escalate today. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.